we have a very special moment in Beneath the Skin history today. Matt has finally gotten a new microphone gifted to him by me. Gifted to him by
I haven't got a
me.
new microphone. I've got an old microphone that Tom gave me.
Yeah, and this microphone requires so much gain to even work that it is impossible for him to clip it. So we're now in the smooth velvet tone era.
I thought the microphone was broken because I had the hardware gain turned to like 50% and it wasn't even registering that I was talking.
For anyone who's interested, a Rode Pod mic requires so much gain that you have to essentially gun it at like 80% or above for it to even work.
Well, I'm sure that makes sense to somebody listening.
It surely does. But you're very welcome to Beneath the Skin, the show about the history of everything told through the history of tattooing. And today we are doing our History of Flash Part 2 episode. You all seem to enjoy the first episode, so we thought we'd do an episode 2. Well, in reality, we got about 45 minutes into the recording and realized, shit, this is going to be like 2 hours long. Let's just do a part 2.
Yeah, it's interesting in a way because I think this episode, in some senses, is a bit less detailed because, like, you know, huge amounts of stuff changes between where we started in the 17th century and where we ended up in around about the 1960s. But yeah, I think it's still worth talking about, partly because I think, you know, as ever, this is the period, this is the period in which J.D. Crowe, the founder of Official Tattoo Brand, who were sort of one of the biggest selling tattoo flash brands on the planet for a long time, basically where the period in which he said basically Flash died. And I wondered, like, we could start this conversation by me asking you whether you think Flash is dead, because I spend a lot of time, as I said, you know, post the death of Twitter, RIP, on Reddit, on the Reddit tattoo forums, and there's loads of discussion there all the time about clients who have been upset or even surprised to learn that their artist has been reusing designs, and even from artists who are anxious or, you know, nervous about reusing designs. And of course, reusing designs is not the same thing as using Flash, but it's going to come into the discussion. So, yeah, what do you think? Just to start, where do you think we are today with Flash, and we can work back?
I don't think Flash is necessarily dead. I think part of the reason for people like having the general thing of, oh, this design is unique to me and solely to me, is the fact that now engaging with tattooing is much more of an individualistic thing. It's like, I see an artist online, I have a conversation with them online, go into the studio and get my tattoo. And for a lot of people who probably are getting their first couple of tattoos as their first interactions with tattoo studios, and they don't really understand how tattooing works, and they look at all the designs on the wall and say like, oh, they must be taken down. But I think it is, yeah, a interesting aspect that I suppose you could call the general atomization of culture, that like people see tattoos on them as solely their own.
And it's funny in a way, right? Because going back to where we got to when we started, that's a nice pivot point, because it was actually, you know, one of the reasons that the 1970s got called by people like Alan Governor the tattoo renaissance, this moment when tattooing was sort of, you know, reborn. I think that's not a good term, but one of the arguments for why tattooing in the 70s is different from tattooing that goes before is that this is the time when art school trained tattooers are really, you know, coming into tattooing, people like Ed Hardy and Cliff Raven and others. And it's that time, right, when you've got art, quote unquote, artists, fine artists working in tattoo shops, you're going to get quote unquote art tattoos. Now, again, I've explained ad nauseum both on this podcast and in print why I think that's a bad argument. But it's funny that this moment when, you know, people like Malone came through Mr. Flash, and then slightly later on, J.D. Crowe with Tattoo Brand, Official Tattoo Brand, and then there are other European equivalents. I don't know. Isn't it weird, Tom, that we've got this moment where the 70s is supposed to at the same time be this moment when Flash gets massive for the first time, and also become the moment when it becomes individualized through art school trained tattooers. I mean, it seems like a weird contradiction to me.
Well, I think one, it is, like I said, the kind of like real birth of like individualistic culture, like the end of the 60s with the kind of hippies that like we are free to choose, like self-determinism, etc., etc. But also I think the influence of art school tattoo artists coming into it, because like until, you know, that point, they are, you know, you're making one design, then you're moving on to the next thing and moving on to the next thing. You're not really necessarily like replicating the same design over and over again. So it's like, I think it's those confluence of those two things, but also there's the influence of it. Like now it's becoming so much more popular that it's like, oh, well, it's gone over the garden hedge now.
It's gone over the garden hedge. Is that a phrase?
Yeah.
I think, and I've been thinking a lot about this, right? So Mike Malone's a really, really, really important figure here because he is an incredible draftsman, incredible businessman, knows everybody, ends up actually inheriting the Sailor Jerry legacy. And through that, right, he ends up saving a lot of these designs for history and remixing them, reworking them. Hardy too.
I think as well, a point that I didn't touch on as well is like, as we're going to start talking about Malone, I think as well the transformation of, you know, you before kind of this point and before kind of in the 60s, you had to know who to get in touch with to get like new Flash, whereas like now, as you're seeing it kind of coalesce into this I suppose commercial product, then you see that transition to it being like, this is a commodity rather than like a piece of art.
That's right. And the scale is just much bigger, right? I mean, we talked last week about people like Zeiss and, you know, even people like Joseph Hartley, Percy Waters, these sort of proto supply companies. In the 70s is the scale just changes, right? Like it absolutely transforms and it becomes enormous. So maybe we'll get on to JD Crow in more detail, but Hardy says of Malone, right? Malone sought to distill and refine the vocabulary from another era, images that resonated with specific social groups in the early to mid 20th century. Though their original symbolism may be nearly lost, the grace and power of the designs have enjoyed a resurgence of popularity among tattoo artists and collectors. As a consummate flash painter, over the years, Malone conducted numerous workshops at tattoo conventions around the country, transmitting to the old techniques to younger artists who are enthusiastically developing their own repertoires from the primary sources. Some subjects invoke deeper art history. The match dolphins based on stylizations perfected by Jerry were in turn taken from classical Greek forms. This transmission of a canon of images, techniques, and beliefs is the core of the tattoo tradition. Malone's iconic compositions are precise and solidly grounded, but his mastery was achieved over several decades of drawing, tracing, redrawing, and tattooing thousands of images. And I think, yeah, the sheer scale of that, right? Both of what goes before it and the breadth of the images that are possible. So certainly by the late 70s and early 80s, you're no longer massively restricted to the kind of military insignia that had been big in the 40s and 50s. And so you've got those two things come together and everything's possible. And it's Flash that does that. Like, again, as Hardy says in this book that he puts together about Malone, it's basically like, tattooers, funnily enough, you know, we're talking about this art school moment, but actually most tattooers can't draw or couldn't draw, and Flash was a way, and Zeiss figured this out too, for a way for people who couldn't draw to become tattooers, right? And so it's, for me, it's this strange contradiction in the historiography where at a moment when tattooing is becoming actually, you know, more obviously standardized through mass production and mass printing techniques, and ultimately, as we'll get to, through the internet, is also the moment when actually artists, particularly artists who understand tattooing, like Malone and Hardy, are getting really interested in its standardized history. You know, I really started paying attention to tattooing as a culture, I suppose, in the early 90s, maybe, like getting hold of, Tattoo Times and things was probably in like maybe 93, 94. I was 13, 14, something like that.
But
And so
at this point in the kind of moving into the 70s, it's like this is where I suppose like tattoos start being represented to a more mainstream audience through cinema and magazines. Like I know the like biker movie movement of the late 60s, early 70s had like part of a role to play in this, and the kind of the weird wacky like features of tattoo artists in magazines started to increase the exposure of it to your normal person.
Again, the real sort of anchor point for that is Lyle Tuttle appearing on the cover of Rolling Stone in 1970. But again, there's this interesting sort of contradiction between the Flash as a standardized sort of language, that is not unique to an individual, and the idea that an individual tattooer can be this sort of rock star. It's something we talked about on last week's recording when we talked about the Tattoo the Earth tour, Tattoo the Planet tour, where the organizer of that tour, Scott Alderman, was like, I could just replace Paul Booth with anyone else.
And
actually, the interesting thing about Flash for me, and this was also something I've been talking about for a very long time, there's a whole section about it in my PhD, it's like no two artists are even going to trace the same bit of Flash the same. So I think that's how you resolve this contradiction, how you get from a moment where you do have incredible artists, as in the kind of conventional sense of that word, as well as a very narrow Flash language.
And I think as well, like this is something for anyone who is interested or our existing patrons, this is something we're going to talk about quite extensively next week in terms of like, the transformative process of, redrawing and reapplying an existing design. For anyone who knows what we're going to be talking about, who's gathered on what I've said, it's going to be a good episode. But like, yeah, no two artists are going to trace the Flash the same. They're not going to tattoo it the same. And it also kind of ignores I suppose like tattoos as an experiential piece of art as well, that like the experience for the person getting the tattoo will never be the same, won't be the same between artists.
That's right, yeah, and it's even things like how they run their machines, what needles they choose to set up, etc., etc. And it was, all kinds of artists, even people that worked in not very sort of quote unquote old school styles, people like Jack Rudy and even Greg Irons, who works in much more fine line styles, were doing flash sheets. But you can sort of imagine like what the resulting tattoos were like from flash artists with such particular styles. It's really interesting. So yeah, I mean the other thing to say is, and this is something I also find super interesting, and we touched upon it last week, last episode we did about Flash, but I want to kind of remind listeners of it, is that what Flash did through the 40s and 50s in particular was allow tattooing to become strange again, paradoxically. So I think, Western tattooing, the kind of traditional tattooing, had become very familiar. Flash basically ensured that you really had, a very limited amount of designs and motifs that you could get. So you got your roses, you got your daggers, you got your swallows, you got your panthers, and that's more or less it. I mean, I'm exaggerating massively, but it's a very, very narrow language. But what that means is that Western tattooing, American traditional tattooing, looks a certain way. And when military men are encountering tattooing in places like Hawaii, traditional tattooing in Hawaii, or in India, or in Burma, they are seeing something that feels very, very different. And so tattooing, which had become fairly familiar over the first half of the 20th century, because Flash makes American, Western, Anglo-European tattooing so different from foreign tattooing, it makes that stuff look weird and strange again by comparison. And I think that's one of the things, paradoxically, that drives what happens in the 90s with Tribal. We talked about the Tribal episode. It's weirdly a backlash to Flash. It's a backlash to Flash and this idea that black work tattooing is something very different to American traditional, Western traditional tattooing. is something that Flash, the growth of Flash allows to happen. So by the 90s, Flash is like a multi-million-dollar business.
Mm-hmm. And it was a point that I was going to make, is that like throughout the late 70s and the 80s, this is kind of a bit of a change in the fact that, like, before we've talked about multiple times that tattoo artists usually supplemented their income with doing just like normal regular jobs, like you could be running a bar, you could be doing one thing or another, but like really it's like artists being solidly able to supplement their income through artistic means.
Yeah, well, of course, actually, that's also, I mean, again, a lot of the drama of the early decade had been to what degree people like Louis the Jew Alberts were ripping off other people's designs and selling them. Again, we talked about this when we talked about the tattoo music tour. If you can, tattooers only have the same amount of time in the day as everyone else. They can only tattoo one person at a time. And so, yeah, having a successful Flash business, selling Flash allows you to make money in a way that's much more sustainable than working simply as a tattooer. Yeah, Flash allows you to become. I mean, it is a business, right? Like it is a business, and as I said, it was this absolutely multi-million-dollar business. JD Crowe had started running this official tattoo brand company, and their first Flash sheet came out in 1991. The designs were drawn in partnership with an artist called Lynn Yowell, and Lynn Yowell, who'd been a billboard and T-shirt designer. And yeah, they reckon they sold 4,000 sheets, this different sheets, design sheets, over the course of their brand.
But that, like, it's interesting because the 90s, like, very much, obviously I was only born about halfway through them, but retrospectively, it very much seems like this is the peak of like shops being plastered in pre-made Flash sheets. Like when we've looked through boxes of like older Flash sheets, this is where you have your sheets of kanji and your dolphins and your tribal stuff, and a lot of this seems to have been like all mail order.
Yeah, I mean, Crowe himself puts the death at 2004. So he says he wrote a really interesting book about these histories of his business recently. But he said on his blog back in 2018, official tattoo brand Flash became a must-have for many tattoo shops worldwide. But by 2004, this multi-million-dollar a year business was put on life support. And I think that's it, right? So there's a combination of a few things. One is saturation. I mean, one of the things about Flash is if you've got so much, you don't need any more, right? We talked about the pork chop sheets and the fact that if you had the Flash that got the cash, if you put the Flash in the window that would get your customers in, that's one thing. But if you've got essentially enough cheap mass-produced Flash that you might even be bootlegging by this point, because photocopiers and things have become, and computer scanners are much more available, you actually don't need to buy any more. So it's a bit of a one and done kind of deal. Unlike smaller, more ironically bespoke sheets of hand painted designs.
Yeah, we're firmly in the era of like the HMV poster rack of Flash.
Yeah, exactly. And ironically, the success of Flash companies like Official Tattoo Brand and like in Europe, Cherry Creek, actually means that you've got all the Flash you could ever need, and if you haven't got it, your mate has, and that's it. What do you think? There's a great one here. So, Official Tattoo Brand sheet 100C, which is one of their most popular sheets. So they've been founded in the end. 89. They put out their first sheet. This is one of their most their 100th sheet. What is it?
Oh, what year is it?
91.
91. So I'm gonna say kanji or tribal, although it's maybe a little bit early for tribal. Does it feature a Tasmanian devil?
No, although it's definitely in that vibe. Here it is,
Okay.
loading on the screen share.
Yep, this makes so much sense. It's a very it's funny, like it is a little bit Greg Irons.
Oh, this is why I find it so interesting. So the sheet is a sheet of pit bulls, right? So in that kind of vibe, it's got that post Jack Rudy, post Good Time Charlie, kind of black and grey illustrative stuff. But this is a mix of style. Got a kind of almost trad look, not quite, but tradish looking black and red Pitbull, which you could do in two colors. You've got a sort of photorealistic one. You've got a really, really like 70s album cover Grim Reaper.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Pointing.
This is like
Holding a Pitbull.
Late era Blue Oyster Cult.
You've got a like real Lal Hardy-esque choppy hair pin-up girl, and you've got just a very nice sympathetic portrait. Like it's this absolutely on one sheet you've got the same design but in different styles, and I think that's also an interesting difference from how Flash would have worked in previous decades, even in the stuff that Malone was putting out in lots of ways, because here you're shopping not just for a design but also for a style, and all of a sudden you're, as a tattoo consumer, you're not just limited to American traditional from Flash. You are also able to get stuff in color realism ish, black and gray, fantasy, etc., etc. Your tattoo consumer in the 90s is shopping for style as well as design, which I find so interesting.
Which is something that, like, I think is also an interesting point, because it seems like very much in the 90s, it seemed like the tattoo industry and artists in general were kind of searching for, like, what is the thing now?
Yeah, well, that's it. I mean, again, as the industry is getting much bigger, and again, I'm just writing my new book at the moment, and the 90s is really the last decade for me, because it is the decade where, funnily enough, through the popularity of Flash, old school American digital comes back into fashion again. It's slightly waned amongst the hip kids, like Ed Hardy in the 70s, who'd been more excited about black and grey, who'd been more excited about Japanese again, who'd been more excited about what we now call tribal. But it was actually the people like Dan Higgs, and we talked about him, and we did an episode about him, and others who versions of it's what Ed Hardy called the new old style, the weird stuff, the weird old stuff. And yeah, it's the 90s last decade, because after that you've got everything again. You can get your real trad stuff, and that's the stuff that I fell in love with in the 90s. You can, and became a thing. You can get versions on that we call new school. You can get your black and grey. You can get your Japanese Orientalists. You can get, what would go on to become biomech and horror and all of the weird variations and hybrids of all those different forms. And it's funny. Again, it seems counterintuitive, but I think the kind of final. It's like what's the metaphor? Like a red dwarf star, right? Like this Flash gets so big and it explodes, and then it can no longer
White dwarf
contain
is what you're thinking of.
Yeah,
you're confusing the life cycle of a sun, but it's also in terms of like positioning the 90s as like the last decade. It is like it's very congruent with like a lot of like popular thinking about history and like the kind of Francis Fukuyama idea of like we have reached the end of history, like this is where it stops. And I would argue against that, in terms of like, yes, you can get whatever you want, but I think it didn't stop progressing past that. Like, I think in terms of like Flash as we knew it, as both this artistic product and this commercial product, I think maybe there is an argument there, but I would argue it's continued past that point.
What do you mean?
So I mean, like, in terms of like Flash as a medium, like of pre-established styles, I think, yeah, you could make the argument that like the 90s are the last decade. But I think as you progress past that, um, as you progress past that, then, you know, there's so much stuff going on in the 2000s and the 2010s and even now that I think has progressed general Flash aesthetics.
Hey, are you enjoying the show? If you really like Beneath the Skin and you want to help support us, you can do so on Patreon. For little as £5 a month, you can help make this show possible, help us buy research materials. So if you like the show and you want to support us, consider kicking us a few quid a month. And you'll get everything from bonus episodes to Q&As, and you can even vote on what tattoo I'll get when we reach a certain subscriber count. Matt, have you got anything to say?
You should really definitely fund the Patreon, because tattoo history is massive, right? Deep, wide, complicated. We're covering some big hit topics on the main feed, but on the Patreon subscriber-only feed, we'll be getting into some really more interesting, niche, deep topics you don't want to miss out on. And honestly, the chance to kind of decide what Thomas gets on his body is probably just a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Subscribe, chuck us a few quid. Don't miss out on the chance to ruin Thomas's body forever.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this hybridization of styles is one thing. Before we move on to I think the main thing on this, which I think is the internet, I want to show you. Well, I want to show you a piece of Cherry Creek. Say what you see. Describe to the listeners what we're looking at, Thomas.
So it's kind of like color illustration, tigers, lions, and cubs with what you would imagine or what you would call tribal designs around them.
Exactly. So this is Cherry Creek Flash from 1997. And this tiger was like the most ubiquitous thing when I was a teenager, like when I was late teens, early 20s. There are so many versions of this Cherry Creek tiger. And again, it's really interesting. As I said, I think like tribal black work becomes a thing because Flash is starting to become popular again, and tribal feels like a way to break away. But then, of course, through Leo Zulueta's Borneo book, where he publishes tribal designs, and then through the appropriation and watering down and just weirdness of stuff like this, you end up with tribe. This is one of the reasons that tribal becomes so cliche, because rather than doing stuff that fits to the body and is beautifully, custom, you just slap this on, and it's a weird hybrid of styles. It's this proper, like, fine line illustrated, grumpy looking tiger on the back of a completely incongruous, totally bonkers piece of kind of acid black work.
Yeah.
So Cherry Creek becomes this byword, right, for 90s designs. The main artist was a guy called Rand Johnston.
Mm-hmm.
And Rand Johnston is, I don't think it's anything we need to go into, but he was president of the Christian Tattoo Association, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, that's an interesting sentence.
Yeah. And he, October 1999, he gave an interview for Christianity Today magazine. So right in the kind of boom period for Cherry Creek.
Mm-hmm.
He's from Wilmar, Minnesota, which is not exactly a hotbed of tattoo history itself. And he said, yeah, he wanted tattooing to become kind of evangelical to some degree. Quote, Johnson, who was a commercial artist for 25 years before he learned the tattooing trade, is an ordinary-looking man with a grey-goated and unfashionable aviator glasses. Compared to many other artists, Johnson is lightly adorned. The only visible tattoo is a large cross on his forearm, but he's something of a star in the tattoo world. When you walk into a tattoo parlor, the walls are covered with colourful art called Flash. If you want a rose, for instance, finger the one displayed on the wall, and the tattooist will use it as his pattern. Johnson is the foremost Flash artist in America. During the first day of the convention, at least half a dozen tattooists stop by his booth and tell him everyone who steps in their shops wants a tattoo of one of his clowns or fish. And I found, on some forums, on some tattoo forums, there are some tattooers today sort of trying to, again, like really appreciating what Johnson was doing artistically. kind of, it's got a bit of a bad rap, as I was saying, but there are tattooers that appreciate what he was doing, and even, of course, a revival of his stuff. Yeah, isn't there something interesting about a guy who was a commercial artist, not a tattooer, for a long time, isn't himself heavily tattooed, and also has this kind of evangelism? I mean, the Cherry Creek Flash is not in itself evangelical, but I think there's something interesting about this kind of desire to spread the word, so to speak, that fits really interestingly into the Cherry Creek story and what happens in the 90s. I don't know. I didn't know that until I started researching for this episode.
Do you know what? But it makes sense in terms of, like, spreading the word through Flash, whether implicitly or not. But also, it also creates this diverging point of, like, stuff being designed not by tattooists. Yeah, well, so he was a tattooer. He was a tattooer, as I said, but only after a long career in commercial art. And the same is true of Lin Yao, who worked for J.D. Crowe. I mean, even Malone, right, was a photographer before he became a tattooer. Kate Hellebrand, one of his early partners, she was also a advertising artist before she became a tattooer. So yeah, people do have these kind of pre lives, and this is maybe a good pivot into where we talk about the internet. It is a pivot where art that was not designed for or designed by people that really understood tattooing and skin became a really interesting and problematic move. I mean, as I said last time, one of the really important things about Flash in its traditional sense, the hand-painted Flash in watercolor that originates in some senses in Japanese painting. Again, this is something Hardy points out, is that, like painting Flash with watercolor and ink and spit on paper replicates the motion or the transience of ink in the skin as it moves. And so learning to produce a design that looks good on paper using watercolor is really, really key to producing a tattoo that looks good on skin. But when you get commercial artists who are used to working in like block color, CMYK, print, vector, block fill, you end up with stuff that is almost by definition a lot flatter because they're used to working not in 3 dimensions on skin or even in the kind of pseudo 3 dimensions of a piece of watercolor, but they're used to working for very, very flat, very, very glossy commercial printing. And I think one of the things that for me makes that 90s Flash look so weird and what's happening with contemporary tattooing with designs taken off the internet, and again we talked a bit about that last time as well, is that it's the medium of the drawing is not matching the medium of the of the tattooing, and that's one of the reasons why it looks so sticker book, like stuck on. Doesn't look part of the body. It doesn't look. It's weird. Like it's sort of uncanny. And this is, it's kind of bringing it full circle back to our first episode in that kind of right now, that tension between like digitally designing tattoos versus like doing them by hand is like, you don't get those layers that are so much more apparent on skin.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, there's some of that in the JD Crowe stuff, although, not it's not uppermost in the aesthetic. But when you get to the Cherry Creek stuff, it is just very, very sort of strangely flat. It looks more like it looks more like work on paper than work on skin, basically. Like very, very, very strange. So I think really for Crowe though, like one of the the real death, as we said, of Flash is 2004, and that is basically the year that internet gets into people's homes for the first time. It's what longtime internet users called the Eternal September. Have you heard of that?
No, I'm not old enough.
So in the early internet, the most people got access to the internet even before the World Wide Web. Things like Usenet would join when they went to college in September. So every September, Usenet bulletin boards and what would become things like web forums would become overwhelmed by newbies, basically by new users going, how the fuck does this work? Acting rude, not understanding the norms of the conversation, like trolling, pissing people off, not knowing how to behave. And then basically by the time all of a sudden everyone's on the internet and it's September all the time. And we are now, in terms of online culture, living in the eternal September. But I think what home internet brought, of course, was the ability to search images on the proto web. I mean, the World Wide Web was started in 1994. It didn't have lots of images on it straight away. Do you know the first image on the internet? This is a sort of little history of everything rather than history of tattooing. But do you know what the first picture on the internet was? It was a flyer for the doo-wop group at CERN called the CERNettes, who were physicists working at CERN in Geneva, were advertising a gig. There you go, little nerd facts for people. Anyway, but yeah, so what the internet brings, of course, is the 4,000 flash sheets of Crow's original tattoo brand multiplied to endless infinity. And yeah, I don't know, like, and we talked a bit about the context of the Tattoo the Earth tour, where all of a sudden you have people wanting to look tattooed in their internet profile pictures, but you also have this gradual move, certainly over the course of the 2000s up to 2010 and beyond, where people are not bringing designs cut out of magazines we talked about last week, but which they're printing off the internet. And this allows new kinds of things to happen. One is that it becomes easier to copy people's custom tattoos than ever before. That had always been happening, but now, weirdly, anything's turned into Flash, right? You sent me a screenshot of someone on Twitter, I guess it was, or was it Instagram, basically saying that, like, if it's online, it's fair game, and I've just got to make a living, and I'll take someone's tattoo. That's something which really wasn't possible in the same way. I mean, and maybe this comes back to where we entered the conversation, where all of a sudden, because the internet flattens everything, because the New York Times and the Louvre and Blogspot and Wikipedia and Pinterest all appear in the same shape on the same size screen in front of you, its information is flattened. Mm-hmm. The design that you can take, so to speak, is just as readily available to you as the photograph of someone's own tattoo they've uploaded. Mm-hmm. Right.
And this is like when moving into maybe about like 2006 with the real birth of social media and like particularly Facebook, that's when you see this sea change in terms of like people's actual tattoos on them being copied. Yeah, but also has the birth of the phenomenon of the tattoo crew neck, of like moving into like the late 2000s, early 2010s, of like people who are only getting tattoos that are visible in photos, so like getting their hands and neck and not having anything else.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I mean. So I think that thing turns, ironically, it kills Flash because everything's Flash now, right? The other thing Crow mentions is, of course, like the iPad. And I think that was a bit slower to come in. But of course, now, if you can produce line work or the click of a couple of buttons from any image, like it's much easier to turn a design that wasn't designed to be tattooed into a design that is tattooable. And one of the real skills of people like Cherry Creek and Mr. Flash, an official tattoo brand, and even what Sailor Jerry was doing, was to sell painted designs that you could hang up in your shop, and then lines that the tattooer could copy and trace onto stencils. Obviously, with designs found on the internet, you don't have ready-made stencils, but turning those designs into stencils is much easier than it used to be. You have also things, of course, like the clone tool and various things that makes patterns. So tattooing has changed stylistically due to these tools being available. But as we said, it has become a lot flatter and a lot stranger. And also, we talked about last week, but it may be worth exploring a bit more now, algorithmically generated. So the popular designs are not just driven by what's in the front of a tattoo shop, but it's what comes up on your Google search when you search flower tattoo, cute tattoo, whatever.
Pinterest, Instagram, like things that are readily available. But I think also an interesting counterpoint to that is, without this period, I don't think you would have the current wave of a lot of people becoming amateur flash painters.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So again, Crow says in this blog post, even though much of commercial flash business has disappeared, many of today's tattoo shops have flashed out with original flash art. And we went brilliant Skin Sorcerer in Malden the other day in Essex. Shout out to Mark. And I'm just mentioning them because that's one of the most recent shops I went into. It was interesting to me that they had on their walls flash designs by people like Paul Dobbelman, Theo Mindell, by those artists who worked at places like Spider Murphy's, who are really like embracing in the early 2000s, again, sort of retrospectively in a nostalgic way, going back to Flash. They had those sheets still up on the walls. There was a really interesting book. Ed Hardy did a book, an exhibition actually in the 90s called Flash from the Past. And in the early 2000s, the Burt Crack and the guys from Smith Street headed up a project called Flash Revisited, where they repainted those old sheets. So that, in a way, for me, was almost that last generation. And those are the sheets you see up in a lot of shops still today. Time is sort of frozen. And so you've got these, as you said, these people who are now online painting Flash, but not even being tattooers, is almost a kind of, again, nostalgic return to this kind of traditional way of doing things. But it does freeze tattoo shops in aspect. Like, we've got, this is the problem with trying to be a historian of this period. Everything's possible now, and you can't nail it down to just one thing, right?
And it's so much harder to do kind of like the historiography of images, because it's like when so much stuff is being grabbed offline and then being transferred to Flash, or like people are reinterpreting images that they found online as Flash, it's much harder to trace the origins back of them.
That's right. I mean, this is where this Flash Revisited book is really interesting. So it was published in 2007. It was put together by Steve Boltz, Burt Crack, and Michael Cruz. And again, Hardy did the intro. So since Flash from the Past, he said, was published in 1994, tattooing's popularity on a global level has increased exponentially. Along with people getting tattooed, research and documentation of the subject has steadily increased. And that this is also something we've mentioned already, where the Flash basically allows people like Sailor Jerry to become household names. Although the look of classic tattoo Flash never died out, during the initial tattoo renaissance, attention turned to alternative traditions. Then, in the early 90s, many younger tattooers and their public rediscovered classic Flash, I think basically due to things like Tattoo Time and Modern Primitives. Today, due to the incredible volume of artists and clients, there are probably more traditional tattoos done than any time in history. The present book is a tribute to the original. It's usual for tattooers today to approach painting Flash as an exercise for its own sake, with results intended to stand alone as artworks in themselves, not as simple sheets for parlor walls. And that's, I think, the point you were making, right? That in an era where you don't need to paint Flash, painting Flash becomes its own thing, a kind of tribute to the history of the practice. Hardy goes on, the enthusiasm and sophisticated artistry of the people in this volume reanimate these old favourites. They continue tattooing's crucial tradition of copying, replicating, and transforming a powerful image bank that arises from roots culture, keeping a strong language alive. And I think if we think, we're now 15 years on from this book, but I'm thinking that people now that are doing painting, people like Darren Quinn, like Olivia Dawn, like Samantha Fung, like Nick York, like people painting not actually American traditional Flash, but painting the real early Victorian Edwardian oil paintings. So going through this nostalgic process of painting in order to work through tattooing. And I think, Flash painting is now something else, right? I think this is the point you were trying to make. It's this signal of anchoring to tradition, this signal of understanding of where tattooing's design book come from, rather than a sort of commercial necessity for being a working tattooer. I've been reading recently about pixel art. The the kind of stuff that was happening in the 90s. Funny enough, people like Mark Ferrari, who was the background artist for LucasArts on games like Monkey Island, and those guys were also stuck with a real set of technological limitations. They only had a certain amount of colors available to them straight away, the sort of standard color palette of the EGA graphics card. But they produce beautiful things. And I bought a book about the history of pixel art, and in it there's an interview with Mark Ferrari, and he basically says it's really amazing to him now that artists are doing pixel art because they want to, not because they have to. They're working with this stupidly limited, absurdly constrained form because it creates creative challenges that are interesting. I mean, there's a kind of aesthetic nostalgia to it too, but Ferrari says about pixel art, the pixel art being done now is much more interesting because it's people who are doing it because they want to, not because they have to. And I think maybe that's true of Flash as well. People now who paint Flash because they want to.
And also interesting as well, in the vein of pixel art, what you have now is a wave of people who are working within the aesthetic of pixel art, but working with much higher density of pixels. So essentially they're recreating the feel and aesthetic of pixel art with much denser definition. And I think people are doing the same with Flash as well. They are like creating Flash designs with much more kind of intricate detail and much less simplistic than you would think of traditional Flash art. Either they're doing it as a hobby or as a working artist.
Well, yeah, and this is one of the interesting philosophical things about nostalgia, right? Like, it is dangerous in some degrees. I've written about this too, about the dangers of nostalgia. Nostalgia originally was a literal disease, diagnosed amongst in Swiss recruits who had been like inscripted into armies far away from home, and then they were kind of sad and maudlin, homesick, basically. But it was early army psychologists were like, maybe it's because they can't hear the cowbells clanging, or maybe it's the lack of altitude, right? Maybe this is the sickness for home. But so nostalgia is dangerous to some degree. It comes with sort of certain potential reactionariness, but it also, in a time when everything is complicated and overwhelming, and as I said, in terms of tattooing, anything is possible. Like, getting back to basics and a limited color palette and the things that work has a kind of calmness to it, has a kind of authenticity. And again, that can be overplayed and can be pushed too hard. And of course, Hardy wasn't just interested in old Flash because it was old, but because it gave a platform for something new. One of the things that's interesting about this return to traditional Flash painting, or this kind of persistent traditional Flash painting, is those that are doing it, I think most of them are interested in actually progressing tattooing rather than locking it down. But it is interesting that in a time when anything is possible, there is something kind of magical and countercultural and important about going back to getting your hands and fingers dirty. Same with ink, right?
Yeah, and I think it's artistically, and this is kind of the point I'll end on, is I think artistically having limitations is a good thing. I know personally for me, and I'm sure for you as a writer, like having some sort of box to work in helps you so much more. And for any artist that are listening, the worst thing that someone could probably ask you is, well, what do you want to do? Because it's then you have to try and figure out, okay, where are the boundaries of what I can do? And when there is no boundaries, it's quite easy to artistically spiral and overcomplicate it, and like also lead to some forms of like self-doubt in terms of the confidence in what you're creating.
Yeah, and parallel to that Revisited project in almost the same year, I think we have mentioned this on the podcast before, was the New School Collective, as they called themselves. Adrian Lee in particular, produced this project basically by giving it was called Full Coverage and then Suits Made to Fit. Full Coverage was the Flash version, where basically tattooers were invited to design a bodysuit with no with no input from clients at all. And then the Suits Made to Fit project was actually making them, some version of them, reality. It was an interesting kind of experiment in this relationship between drawing, creativity, and client interaction. But yeah, the tattooers interviewed for that project said exactly that. They found, like, here's a blank bit of paper, do whatever you want.
Yeah.
Very, 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 very difficult, because tattooing is inherently a collaborative, unless you're tattooing yourself, is a collaborative art, you know. And at the same time, as I said, as this Smith Street Burt Crack version of Flash rediscovery is happening, a much more kind of esoteric version of the same thing with some of the same people involved, to be honest, was happening back in 2006, 2007. And of course, you give tattooers a blank canvas, and many of them are going to do skulls and roses.
Yeah, because
Right?
because you will automatically return to what's familiar and what is understandable.
Yeah. And again, I think it's no surprise that those two things are happening at the same time in the tension of this immediate social era of the birth of social media. Like, when you have social media for the first time and anything is possible, tattooers are instinctively, like, at sea. They don't know what to do. They know what works as well. It's not just driven by panic, it's also driven by deep understanding and knowledge of their craft. And what works are the things that have worked really for hundreds of years. I mean, you know, the basic bedrock, many of the bedrock images of Western traditional Flash go back to in terms of tattooing, as we talked about last week, back to the 17th century, right? So yeah, this is if people can find those two books, that they were really influential to me in my thinking. They came out both while I was doing my PhD, and I write about both of them. The revisited Tribute to Flash from the Past book by the Smith Street guys, and then the double project of Full Coverage and Suits Made to Fit by the New School Collective, led by Adrian Lee, including, you know, also like Grimey's in that, and like there's Matt Sharma as well, very importantly, the New York Adorned people, like that kind of moment in time, I think, is a super interesting moment where Flash becomes a creative experiment in and of itself, and I think that's what we still see today.
Mm-hmm. And I think that is where we're going to leave it today. Want to thank all of you for listening. As always, we do have a Patreon. If you enjoy the show and want to support us or hear more, for as little as £3 a month, you can get some extra episodes. You can hear episodes early. We have different tiers. For the £10 and above tier, you get a shout out. For £15, you get a signed copy of Matt's book, Painted People. But without further ado, I want to thank Stephen McCann, Roy Hoxema, Morpheus Ravenna, Chris Block, Charlie Lightning, Baba Vextra, Shit Jesus, Reed Forden, Lupe Calderon Garnica, Kirsten Wright, Kathleen Burkhardt, James Schick, and Dylan. Thank you to all of our patrons as well. And thank you to everyone who listens. If you enjoy the show you can't support us, consider leaving us a review or sharing an episode with a friend. And once again, we will be at Brighton Tattoo Convention the last weekend in February, booth 109. We're doing a poster reveal soon over on our Instagram, Beneath the Skin Pod, and the reveal of a super, super cool merch design.
Tattoos exclusively from old Flash as well, in fitting from this by Sammy on our booth. Two quick things from me. One is just to say, there's a couple of people who are still waiting for their free books. Because I ran out. I didn't realize I'd run out of books. I'm getting some more in. You will get your book very soon. I'm very sorry. And then, as we're trying to do the bibliography for this week. Includes Bullseyes and Black Eyes, The Art of Michael Malone on Hardy Marks, JD Crow's Story of Official Tattoo Brand book. He's worth a follow, JD Crow with an E, tattoos on Instagram. The revisited Flash from the Past book and its predecessor, Flash from the Past from '94. and the New School Collective books, Full Coverage and Suits Made to Fit, which came out in around about 2006. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening.
Have a good time.
Bye.
Bye.